Hey there, and welcome. Have you ever just stopped and wondered why every single culture on Earth since, the beginning of time has told these incredible stories? I'm talking myths about gods, heroes, monsters, the whole shebang. Well, today we're going to try to decode that. We're diving into the fascinating theories scholars have come up with to explain this deeply human need to tell stories.
So let's just get right to it with the big question. Seriously, take a second. Why do we do this? Is it just to explain why the sun rises, or to feel like we have some control, or is it something way deeper than that? That's the puzzle we're going to tackle together today.
And here's our roadmap for this whole thing. We'll start by looking at just how big this puzzle is. Then we'll explore three major schools of thought. Theories that see myths as a kind of twisted history, theories that say they come from inside our own minds, and theories that see them as the glue that holds society together. And then we'll talk about how you can use these ideas as a kind of toolkit before we loop right back to our big question.
Okay, let's dive into this universal puzzle. The question of why myths is definitely not new. Scholars have been wrestling with this for centuries, and honestly, their search for an answer tells a pretty fascinating story all by itself.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The theories people come up with about myths, well, they say a lot about the time period they were living in. The way a Victorian scholar looked at a myth is going to be completely different from how a 20th century psychologist did, right? Each answer is like a snapshot of its own era.
So, our first stop on this journey is a bunch of theories that look for the origins of myth out in the real world, in actual events, and in things people actually did.
Okay, so this is one of the oldest and, frankly, most straightforward ideas out there. It's called euhemerism. And the basic idea is that gods like Zeus or heroes like Hercules, they weren't actually divine. They were probably just real, flesh-and-blood kings or amazing warriors from way, way back. And over centuries of retelling, their stories got bigger and bigger and bigger until, poof, they became myths. And then there's this related idea, the ritual theory. A guy named J.G. Fraser is the big name here. And his thinking was the action came first. People were performing some ritual, maybe for a good harvest, for generations, and only way later did they cook up a story to explain why they were doing it. The myth basically becomes the instruction manual for the ritual. But hold on. What if we've been looking in the wrong place entirely? What if the source of myth isn't out there in history, but deep inside the human mind? This next batch of theories totally changed the game.
So the psychologist Carl Jung comes along with this radical, kind of mind-blowing idea. He suggested that all of us, no matter where we're from, share a collective unconscious. Think of it like a shared psychic hard drive that we're all born with, and it's filled with these universal patterns he called archetypes. The wise old man, the trickster, the great mother. Jung believed that myths are basically our brains telling stories using these built-in universal characters.
And this right here is probably the most famous archetype of them all. The scholar Joseph Campbell built on what Jung was doing and found this universal story pattern he called the monomyth. You probably know it as the hero's journey. And it's everywhere, from ancient epics to the latest superhero movie. A hero gets a call to adventure, they've faced some huge ordeal, they're transformed by it, and they come back with some kind of gift for their people. Sound familiar?
So, we've looked at myth as history, myth as psychology, but what if its main job is social? What if myths are the stories we tell ourselves to keep our communities from falling apart? For thinkers called functionalists, like Bronislaw Malinowski, myths are incredibly practical. They're not just for fun, they're a social charter. A myth can explain why a certain family gets to be in charge, why a law has to be followed, or why a custom is sacred. They're basically the ultimate because I said so for an entire society's structure.
All right, now this next idea from the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss is a little more abstract, but it is so powerful. He didn't care as much about what a myth was about as he did about how it was built. He believed myths are a special kind of logic, a way for our brains to deal with the fundamental contradictions of being alive. He called them binary oppositions.
And just think about the big ones: life versus death, nature versus culture, order versus chaos. How do you square those circles? Well, for a structuralist, myths don't necessarily solve these problems, but they create a story that lets us think about them and makes them feel manageable.
So now we've got all these different theories, right? And the most important thing to get is that none of them is necessarily the one right answer.
A better way to think about them is like different lenses in a toolbox. Each one lets you see a myth in a totally new and interesting light.
This here is basically our toolbox summary. You've got Fraser connecting myth to ritual, Jung connecting it to our deep psyche, Levi-Strauss focusing on the hidden logical structure, and Campbell, who's all about that universal pattern of the hero's journey. 4 really powerful tools, and each one gives you a different way into a story.
Okay, so let's actually put these tools to work. We're going to look at the Filipino myth of Bernardo Carpio. He's this giant with unbelievable strength who's trapped between 2 mountains that are constantly crashing together. And every time he struggles to break free, it causes an earthquake. Pretty cool, right?
So if we put on our functionalist lens, we'd ask, what job is this story doing for people? Maybe it's a simple way to explain a natural disaster like an earthquake. Or maybe Bernardo is a powerful symbol of a nation struggling for independence, giving people a social charter for being resilient.
Now let's switch to the archetypal lens. Suddenly, we might see Bernardo Carpio as the classic trapped giant or slumbering hero that you see in so many cultures. Is his story a kind of hero's journey, even if he's still in the middle of his ordeal and hasn't come back with the prize yet?
And finally, with our structuralist lens, we look for the deep tension. This story is clearly wrestling with some huge opposing forces, right? Human strength versus the awesome power of nature, freedom versus being trapped, or maybe social order versus the pure chaos of an earthquake. The story is a space to think about all that.
Which brings us all the way back to the beginning. After looking through all these different lenses, what can we say? Why on earth do we tell myths?
Well, it turns out there's no single, simple answer, but we have a bunch of really powerful ideas. Maybe we tell them because they're faded memories of real history, or to give meaning to our traditions. Maybe we tell them because the stories are literally hardwired into our brains, or to keep our society strong, or to help us wrap our heads around a complicated, contradictory world.
And this quote really just nails it. There's no master key that unlocks every myth. Each one of these theories is just a different window, offering its own unique and totally valuable view of why these stories matter so much to us.
And in the end, this stuff isn't just about ancient tales. We all use stories, every day, to make sense of our own lives, our world, our place in it all. So the real final question isn't just about myths from the past. It's for you, right now. What story are you using to explain your world?